I don't know if it glitched for you or not, or just for me. Anyway, okay. As I warned in my intermission video, or whatever you want to call that one, that I didn't really get any views for that this weekend. Anyway, this is one of those videos that I'm going a little more into depth in things that I didn't discuss therein. So beginning with the beginning, very, very important to dive into lexicon and terminology a little bit. Distinctions in the subcategories, if you will. So at the top of the pyramid, you know, we have the catch-all phrase nerd, right? Now a nerd is usually a smart overachiever who is an outcast for one reason or another. Now, a nerd can be quiet and studious and, you know, in that kind of stereotype, and a wallflower and shy and whatnot. Whereas a more ostentatious person would often be considered a geek. And geeks are not usually considered intelligent, though, because they're too spastic. But if they're too spastic, then they become a spaz, which has nothing to do with intellect at all. So going in the 80s, movies and other pop culture things would use some of these terms interchangeably or incorrectly applied and this and that. Like in 16 Candles, the guy is called the geek, but he doesn't refer to himself as a geek. He calls himself the king of another word that I could probably say it on YouTube, but I guess I won't for now. If you know, you know, and it is, but he's the king of that. And of course, that is a word that is definitely referred to usually as people who are very low IQ, whereas the guys he's hanging out with are geeky science guys. So definitely not low IQ guys, blah, blah, blah. So everything got really messy. But the quintessential nerd in the 80s was the Anthony Michael Hall character in The Breakfast Club, where he's, very smart, very worried about his GPA, alienated from his peers, but in this case, alienated also from his family, which is like not automatic and a side issue and da-da-da-da-da. Because that whole movie was all about, the class warfare, but also the age gap, or what do you call it, the generation gap, blah, blah, blah. So, because they referenced the 60s and, did we think we'd end up here, Carl? Oh, don't be a goof, that kind of thing. I'm doing it all out of context. Anyway, but then you had the surge of other mid-80s comedies, Weird Science and My Science Project and Project X, and Project X was more of a military movie, but ish, but had to do with research and whatnot. But I was thinking War Games, computers, big undercurrent, technology, Revenge of the Nerds 1 and 2. Yeah, I'm not going to get into the premises of all these films. I'm just saying there was a bunch of them. And of course, again, the best one that wasn't necessarily the most popular one was Real Genius. And of course, that was where the nerds are trying to defy certain stereotypes. And, Chris Knight's whole ethos is showing Mitch how to have a good time and not just be stuck in the laboratory and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I'm not going to go into all that, like I said, in detail. But there is a scene that very is informed in Real Genius where, because Chris Knight has been wearing silly T-shirts and Hawaiian print shorts and things for the duration, when the final exams come around, he is wearing, it's a pink one, but he's wearing your basic Oxford cloth button shirt. But then on the feet, he's got the bunny slippers as a joke, right? To show his professor, the middle fingers, oh, I'm taking this exam seriously, enough, right? And I can still dress like you want me to dress, like, the teacher's pet or mama's boy or whatever the terminology. Anyway, so like, for example, the side hack or the sidebar or whatever of all of that was, of course, like Weird Al Yankovic, who was like the nerd king in the music realm, but he wore the Hawaiian shirts and the checkerboard Vans sneakers and, you know, Levi's jeans, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I've already done whole videos about the Hawaiian shirts and that kind of thing, so I won't go into the whole hula print, because again, that's a subcategory and a side thing. And he was obviously an intelligent guy, and he had the glasses and the funny hair and the mustache, you know, the afro kind of thing. But that wasn't like nerd chic, all 100% or whatever. And so yeah, I mean, you know, if you're going to subcategorize, but then of course in the geek realm, you know, again, these aren't all stupid people or dipwads, as they would dub it on TBS when they broadcast the 16 Candles film. But they had interests that were all considered nerdy or geeky, apart from just computers or entrepreneurship or whatever, you know, like comic books and superhero movies, which of course became even bigger in, you know, later decades with more special effects and all that kind of thing. And so you have now a subculture similar to the Hawaiian shirts of people who only wear silly t-shirts or whatever, which kind of became a thing in the 80s. But it was kind of weird how you had a lot of overlap between kind of what was counterculture and punk rock and what was everything they hated, which was nerds kind of doing the same thing. Like these shoes, I'm really going to, I guess I'll start with footwear as I try to integrate things in. You know, these shoes were pretty common for people of all subcultures or cliques or whatever in high school, because this would be considered kind of nerdy footwear, maybe. I mean, the low top ones were not popular. The high top ones were the popular ones, and I found over time that I just hated wearing the high top ones. And these were more throwback to the 60s look, because in the 60s the low tops had become the kind of default college look shoe. One of them anyway. And I know they always reference loafers, but actually this was very, very collegiate in the 60s, which of course led to the high tops being very counterculture in the 70s or whatever, because grown men aren't supposed to be wearing canvas shoes much apart from going to the lake on the weekend or whatever. But the black ones obviously being the most common, white ones being more common. Mine was always the blue or some other colors. The blue was kind of my signature color. I barely ever wore the red ones because they just look like clown shoes. But cool guys could wear the red ones or the pink ones or something and, you know, rock it in the 80s or 90s and get away with it again and be counterculture or whatever. So not a one and done automatic nerd thing, but definitely kind of a nerd accessory, but also a vintage throwback, again, accessory. These are also like the worst shoes for your feet whatsoever. I don't hardly wear them. I don't know why I have 2 pairs of them, but I do. Or 3 or 4 actually, if you count the other ones. But in the 80s, a lot of the things that were just commonplace in the 60s, before you had the Nike shoe revolution, and because in Breakfast Club he does wear Nike sneakers, the Anthony Michael Hall character, were Nikes automatically nerdy? Not necessarily, but they were kind of a yuppie thing at first and then became more mainstream. And in the 80s you had different eras of footwear, and I'm not going to go into all that because again, a pair of 80s Nikes will look slightly different than a more modern pair of Nikes. You know, they've had different iterations, so I don't know if you could find ones that look exactly like the ones he had still anymore. But other shoe companies like Converse and Vans started making shoes that were more similar to each other, that were upgrades, that weren't just the canvas, that had suede and leather and da-da-da-da-da. And those aren't considered nerdy footwear, but nerds will wear them if they feel like it, you know. But so anyway, so the top side, again, I didn't bring in the loafers. The loafers were more of the adult version, and then the boat shoes were more of the youth version. So I went with the boat shoes because, again, the 60s and the 80s being 2 different things. See, these were considered perfectly normal. Anybody could wear them shoes up until like the 70s. In the 80s, these all of a sudden became two things, either super preppy or super nerdy, depending on who was kind of wearing them. These were not, you know, cool punk rock shoes like combat boots or destroyed sneakers or whatever. They were not, there's different types of boat shoes too. I just grabbed these are slightly different Camp Mock ones that are a little less boat shoey. So these could be considered, again, do you want to consider them more preppy or you want to consider them more nerdy? Because they're a little more refined, so a nerd would be more likely to gravitate toward them actually than this. But then certain slovenliness kind of thing is part of the Ivy style roguish appeal. So these could be considered actually more preppy, even though they're less refined. Like weird, like I said, there's no real simple one and done answer. Whereas of course a true nerd who's a business person is wearing, you know, black Oxford shoes with his business suit, right? If he's, again, an entrepreneur. But then you had Steve Jobs who wanted to wear his weird clothes or whatever and not dress like a businessman, even though blah, 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 blah. So I don't know that he's so much considered the nerd, though. Wozniak, as everybody knows, is the innovator and all that. I really should have switched to part 2 when I started talking about the shoes, maybe. I don't know. Doesn't matter. Anyway, so I guess we'll call it part 2. We'll say we're moving into part 2. Part 2. Even though we're into the clothing fashion-y aspect of the project already. So part 2, let's just talk about shirts. Because that's what I have the most of. And that's what most people will see first, right? I guess. First-ish. So as I talked about the penultimate shirt, and we'll have a big, we'll have a back and forth kind of discussion. Again, the Oxford cloth, these being the little bean ones, other people make the same thing. The stripe ones being very, very popular in the 60s and the 80s. The solid color ones being kind of more of a default because people kind of see this more as almost office casual than just Ivy style or college style or whatever, maybe even more than the striped ones. But of course, these can be worn with or without a tie. They have the button collar, which is setting them apart slightly from a true dress shirt. And I do have, it's kind of buried. Let me grab it. See, whereas this is a true dress shirt, but this color is a little too fashionable for a typical nerd. And of course, I'm wearing this instead of a solid. This is a slightly different cloth, tattersall. Not the exact same thing as the Oxford cloth, but pretty close. So something like this, or even shinier ones, or other fashionable colors. Little more mall guy, a little less, club guy, a little less true nerd. But it does have a more structured collar than the button downs. And then sort of same thing, like this is a bit more of a, heavy dress look, a vintage, older vintage look. It's meant to be worn with cufflinks, da-da-da-da-da. This is a little bit more fashionable, fashion forward-ish, or whatever you want to say, than a nerd might go for with the contrast collar. And again, if you're trying to be a wallflower, you're not trying to stand out and impress people with your clothing. You're more likely to go with the dumbed down version. This one has a spread collar though, so it's a more modern shirt. And again, another thing that most nerds would shy away from in that respect, because they're not trying to be trendy and it doesn't work with as many good tie knots and that kind of thing. But the basic pattern being, just a simple kind of Glen check. Not necessarily an automatic nerd pattern, but one that I've brought in a bunch because that's what I kind of have lying around at this time of the year, this season. Like this sport jacket. I'll talk about jackets more in a minute. Again, though, the Glen check. and the hats, which I'll talk about in a minute. Don't worry. Wherein again, or whereas, or there was, stuff when we went to shop at like department stores like Mervyn's or whatever, everything was pretty easily defined, delineated. You had the Cambridge Classics stuff that was the collegiate prep business casual stuff, and then you had the High Sierra stuff, which was your rugged outerwear-ish stuff. Some of it a nerd could wear, some of it would be a little too blue collar, a little too rugged, a little too, this and that for academic pursuits, that sort of thing. So again, these are the LL Bean ones, but Cambridge Classics had like every color of this Oxford cloth fabric. And maybe Cambridge Classics had more dressy shirts like the other ones I just put down there with the Glen checks, or the solid, etc., etc. And solid white, of course, and solid blue, of course, being both office and college shirts traditionally. Whereas something like this, well, this is J.C. Penney, not Mervyn's, but kind of the same thing. It doesn't have, it does have a button-down collar. It does have a patch pocket instead of chest flap pockets and all that kind of thing. So this could go either way, but it does have a bolder pattern, so not necessarily office appropriate, maybe for casual Fridays-ish, but more of a work shirt than a school shirt. And so I have a whole stack here beside me. You can see them coming. Excuse me. Just give me a second. So yeah, again, one that could go either way. Another J.C. Penney. We have the button-down collar. We have the wrong side single patch pocket instead of the flat pockets, but the design a little bit robust, a little bit more work shirt again than school shirt. This one, the pattern being just totally outdoorsy, not very nerd, classic nerd, whatever you want to call it. This one even less so because it has cowboy yokes and flat pockets and snaps and really, 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 it's not the colors that are wrong. It's the way the colors are done, right? Because you can have autumny stuff that could still be nerdy, but most nerds, again, aren't looking for autumn fashion colors. When selecting their wardrobes, they're just picking more utilitarian pieces. So you could use this on the weekend as a utilitarian piece, but you'd be less likely to pick it up, in the first place. You'd be more likely to grab something like this where it's more low key. If you're talking, again, very strict, nerd habits. Whereas, again, this more of a real man, 60s hunter, North Woods lumberjack look. Not especially nerdy, but the hipsters picked it up and maybe tried to make patterns like this nerdy now. I don't know. But traditionally, and no button collar, just a regular collar. It still only has one pocket, but the pocket does have a button through. That's just a kind of lazy choice on behalf of this company that they should have gave you two pockets, is what that says. It's like, we know we're cheaping out. Buy it or don't, but it's a nice soft flannel, so I bought it because when I'm not feeling so nerdy and I want to feel cozy, it's perfectly fine. Whereas then in Dead Poet Society, the other big film that came out kind of after the slew of the other 80s movies had run their course, and I'm dressed kind of honoring the Dead Poet look, right? Except I'm wearing corduroy pants instead of wool dress, and these are 5-pocket jeans, not more traditional. I'll talk about pants a little bit more at length in a minute, but I've talked about all these things before. But if you're new to the channel, then you haven't heard it, so hooray. Hopefully you got 20 minutes in, because there's another 20 minutes to go. But in Dead Poet Society, it shows them wearing a lot more stuff like this, where they are wearing kind of refined flannels. And this, of course, another J.C. Penney one with the button down and the single patch pocket. But not, you know, as in your face of a work shirt pattern, you know, almost a window pane, refined look to it where you wouldn't automatically know it's a flannel shirt compared to a regular sports shirt, except the fabric's a little bit thicker and it's, you know, brushed, yada, yada, yada. I'll be showing the more typical sports shirts in a minute that are often always mistakenly called flannel shirts just because they have a pattern, but they're actually the more refined version of this, but again, less cozy. Which, again, why you might need a sweater over it, this one being cotton instead of wool, blah, blah, blah. And then other shirts that, again, can go kind of either way between work and nerd, but also could go preppy as opposed to work, which preppy and nerd, again, being a very slight nitpicky distinction that we haven't really completely come to grips with. But again, you don't have to be an intellectual in any capacity to be a preppy or dress preppy or even get into these schools, apparently, in some cases. So here again, we have a bolder pattern. Again, not quite office casual friendly, but certainly not bad for school use. Like you could wear this with a jacket or without a jacket. You could wear this, maybe not so much with most ties, but it does have the button detail. It does have the single pocket, but it also has pretty, you know, nice conservative colors and a nice arrangement. So it's not screaming lumberjack like, you know, some of the other ones. And then, of course, I've shown this one before too, even better, gray. This looks like almost exactly like the one that the guy rides his bike down the Knox with the sweater around his neck, which is a total preppy look, not nerd. You know, he definitely looks kind of stylish when he's doing it, but he is wearing, again, the high tops. He is wearing regular khaki pants, and he is wearing a flannel shirt. So again, I don't know how accurate that movie is entirely. I've talked about that in a separate video. I did 2 videos about Dead Poet Society fashion and stuff already, I think. So you can go back and watch those. Usually I look up all the numbers that go with the stuff, but I don't know if I can find it quickly in a playlist right now. One of them maybe not. Well, preppy style, I did episode 245. I talked about some of this, and no, it's not in that playlist. And where was the Dead Poet Society? See, it's stuff like this. Oh, 255. So 2 months ago as opposed to like a month ago. Although that 2 months I think is pushing. I think it's more like 3 months. It hasn't updated yet or whatever. But if you go back, yeah, through the playlist, you'll find it. So that brings us to, well, this is for combinations. Okay. What I was just talking about, there is a gray area. Again, a nerd might not want something like this so much because of the spread collar and the bolder-ish pattern, but it's still kind of conservative colors. You could still throw a sweater over it. You know, I have a couple different sweaters here. Talk about sweaters again in a minute. But this is an acceptable office casual shirt. This is, and also an acceptable school shirt. Although, again, this detailing a little more fashion / business than collegiate or preppy. Going back in a minute. So something like this. This is not a flannel. This is a sport shirt, but it has a very bold pattern, borderline not office casual appropriate anymore. Again, borderline too ostentatious or flashy for all nerds, but kind of a nice holiday kind of thing. You could pair it with this for, you know, a real festive look, or you could pair it with a blue cover to, you know, mute it down. and just let the red only show in the sleeves mostly, that kind of thing. That would be a little bit more of a nerd play. This would be a little bit more of a Clark Griswold or geeky play. But if you're going to the holiday party at the office, this would work. But then on Monday morning, you could wear this and maybe still get away with it, that kind of thing. But again, a lot of nerds still going to gravitate more towards solids than patterns as a stereotypical rule. And this is the exact same thing as I'm wearing here, just another cotton V-neck. Cotton V-necks, also a cotton V-neck. They can be substituted for wool ones, but I'm not suffering from, no central heating and whatnot. This one, kind of same thing, except this one's an LL Bean pattern, which is a tartan that you could wear with the burgundy, and it covers over a lot of the green. So less nerdy though, because a little subdued, a little bit nice, but still can be a nerd style, I guess. I don't know. Just because, again, you're adding the, excuse me, a little bit sweaty. You're adding the intentionality behind it as opposed to just grabbing things that work. Which, again, in the movie The Fly, another mid-'80s movie, he talks about Einstein having 5 of the same exact suit and 1 overcoat. That way he didn't have to think about what he was going to wear every day and would have less decision fatigue and free up his brain to concentrate on his scholastic pursuits or whatever. Einstein, of course, at that point, not being a student anymore, though, being a professor and expected to wear a suit. Not all nerds want to wear suits or always wanted to wear suits, but we'll get to that in a minute. Which I guess brings us to part 3. I'm going to run out of type cards for parts again. Part 3. So if you're scrolling, if you're skipping ahead, yep, here we are at 27 minutes. Wherein I will talk about the sweaters now at length, even though pants should maybe come first. We're going into sweaters. So less, again, splitting hairs, a little less nerdy might be something like, a Fair Isle print or whatever. A little more preppy, a little less nerdy-ish. Because, again, it's a pattern and it's calling attention to yourself in a more positive way than a leave me alone, I'm too smart to be bothered with trivial things like compliments way. I know I look nice. Why wouldn't I look nice? When did I not look nice? Whatever the defensive thing might be. Of course, a cable sweater, getting a big resurgence, the Harry and Sally thing. But is Harry truly a nerd? Harry's kind of a weirdo, but he's not really intellectually, likes basketball and making non-politically correct jokes and this and that and that. Yeah, and he's definitely a womanizer, which is not typically nerd domain. It's a part of the problem with being a nerd is it's hard to attract the women until you make your first billion. Again, the characters in 16 Candles and Breakfast Club and all that aren't, and Ferris Bueller, not Ferris, who's supposedly so cool that everybody loves him, but his buddy that, nobody at the school even knows he's alive, much less want to talk to him. But he dressed, again, not very nerdy. He was kind of more crossing over into that superhero counterculture thing, which actually I need to backtrack. Once again, we did things slightly out of order. I forgot these shirts is all. So back to part 2. Back to part 2. My fault. Again, the rugby shirts and the polo shirts, especially polo shirts. Cool guys could wear the polo shirts, but they were also nerd domain because everybody just kind of had polo shirts. Again, rugby shirts, like in Wedding Crashers, it's the tough guy, the preppy guy, who's the bad guy, who's wearing the rugby shirt, not the nerdy guy, because he's athletic. And nerds, of course, are traditionally, too studious and no upper body strength or whatever, all that, you want to get on all that. So rugbies and polos, hit or miss. Again, another gray area where they are preppy, but they're also genteel, not rugged, not manly. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute when we get back to, well, what I was talking about with the flannel shirts and the blue collar thing. So back to part 3. Oh, wait, not quite. No, it's still part 2. Again, I was talking about the in the 80s, or maybe more starting in the 70s, you could have like the goofy t-shirts and things. You wouldn't know this was actually from a university, right? But definitely kind of a nerdy item, similar to video games. That's the one thing I forgot to mention. The video games, another pop culture thing, along with comic books and da-da. But see, arcades weren't originally only nerd domains either, and then gaming became such a, not even necessarily an intellectual thing, but its own subculture thing that is still kind of nerdy, because again, the guys would rather play the video games than spend their time and money on the girls, or the girls don't want to talk to them anyway because they think they're just weirdo shut-ins. Whole dynamic thing, don't necessarily want to go into that in terms of just achieving a look. Trying not to get into too much heavy, extra stuff than the basic. But so other types of sweaters that I've showed before. Again, some of these are V-necks and some of these have sleeves. So again, Argyle being one of those ones that is preppy, but definitely still nerdy. It's one of the few areas where instead of a solid, Argyle was very popular with a lot of the nerd style thing. But also club guys would rock this kind of thing too once in a while, if they weren't just the total suit guy. A casual look of this would be with a pair of Oxford kind of shoes and suit pants, but then with this up top. And those guys were not intellectuals at all. They were just trying to achieve looks to go be pimping on the weekends and attract girls who liked disco dancing and such. So, like, hey, I'm smart. Look, I dress like a smart guy. Therefore, and maybe have the wire frame glasses that don't have lenses and not the thick Buddy Holly thing going on. But more Argyle. Argyle comes in many shapes and sizes, but as you notice, my collection is mostly earth tones. There might be others. I have some blue and green ones that I couldn't find also that I like, that I've shown in other videos. And this being a very nerdy shirt. The problem with this one being that it's acrylic instead of a better fabric, and it's actually Dockers, who, I don't know, they're owned by Levi's, but they tend to make kind of nice but disappointing things. But this one has lasted for quite a while, as much as I've worn it. And I had some Mervyn sweaters that were acrylic way back when too, and they lasted forever. So for all the claims that fast fashion and artificial fibers and stuff don't hold up, it's not entirely true. But of course, that's the part of the retro 60s and 70s thing that nobody wants to talk about, is how much of it was polyester. That was the big part of the 80s, the Revenge of the Nerds movie, is that the guys are wearing these polyester business shirts, that are outdated, outmoded, or not cool at all in any manner of speaking, So again, this one, a little more simple design, a little kind of vintage look to it, maybe a little nicer than nerdy, a little more old money or preppy or whatever. I didn't really use the term old money much in this video, even though it's in the title card, because I don't think old money is that much I think it's just a rebranding of existing stuff. So here's a nice. This one's almost too nice to be nerdy. This is very, very preppy though. Again, the neutral style colors that are very old money, even though I bought this before old money was a thing. It's a medium, so it's so small that it's so old that I don't even think I can wear it anymore. So it's not new. I didn't buy it because of an old money trend. I can promise you. Sorry, my hair got I was just getting warm in here. Well, anyway, sweaters, but again, there's different types of, they don't all have to be the same kind of sweater. In Breakfast Club, he wears an inside out sweatshirt instead. I've never understood that. I've never known anybody who's worn sweatshirt fleece wear inside out for any purpose at all. I think they just wanted to keep it in the budget and thought it would look more like a sweater if they turned it inside out or something, because there was literally no reason for him to be wearing that like that at all. Okay, so part 4, we're moving to part 4 for real. Part 4, like we're playing golf. Okay, pants, trousers. Like I said, I was wearing, I still am. I'm wearing corduroy pants, but they're not the exact style that these are. These are a little more refined. So again, more preppy, but also more nerdy, but also more old money. So they have button through pockets instead of patch pockets. This one does not have pleats though. Pleated would be a little bit more correct. But this company is a cheap company, so they don't make pleated. But they do have the French cuff instead of just a singular button. So for those of you who don't know, it has this extra flap that buttons on the inside, which makes going to the restroom a little bit more tedious. And it does have pretty deep pockets instead of like military style slash pockets or something. And this is a more fine whale corduroy than some of the ones that I have that are less nerdy and more vintage, and therefore a lot more 60s preppy. This is definitely a more throwback to 70s and 80s staples that everybody wore until they got to like junior high, and then corduroy was considered not cool anymore because you were allowed to pick your own clothes and you didn't have to wear what your mom bought, which is another thing that a nerd and my mom would have in common is if they see it on the clearance rack and it's only $3, they buy it regardless of how ugly the colors are. So I would often be telling my mom, take it back, but it was only $3. It's like, that's $3 I'd rather use to buy a Slurpee and a burrito. I don't care. I really am never going to wear this ugly, ugly, ugly shirt. But so at some point though, yes, nerds did wear Levi's jeans starting in the 70s or even maybe the 60s. Everybody owns Levi's jeans. I'm not saying they don't, but it shouldn't be your go-to. But as I've told people, because I knew people 10 years ago or whatever, who were having the 80s resurgence parties and talking about how they were going to get everybody dressed all 80s. And I was like, well, that's not 80s. This is 80s. This is 100% 80s. Put a little alligator here or a little tiger. Not automatically required, or instead of the PK fabric, get the more t-shirt fabric so you can see the texture. This is a true polo shirt, whereas this is a fake rugby shirt. The other rugby shirt I showed is also more fake. Okay, I don't need to show that. A true rugby shirt has this weave. There you go. But if you want to look quintessentially 80s, get this in pink, get this in powder blue with some other different stripes, get this in white. Done. But again, that's more preppy than automatically nerd. But it is very, 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 very 80s. And You can wear it with either. Either of these goes with that outfit. That's 80s pure and simple. Again, you might want to get the high tops of this, although they'd be covered over by the jeans. So if you're wearing shorts, you might want the low tops more. I don't know. But then you're not wearing 501 jeans, you're wearing shorts. So, you know, do it that way you will. And the shorts can be corduroy or Hawaiian print or blah, blah, blah. Again, that's if we're doing an 80s thing, not if we're doing nerd thing. Nerds not really known for shorts, wearing shorts like ever. They have pale, skinny legs. They don't want anyone to see their pale, skinny legs. They're covering their legs. So the next, again, if you're not wearing a business suit, and I'll save that for last, you're wearing probably some pleated chinos. They don't have to be pleated. They don't have to be blue. Again, a nerd is not going to delve into too many funny colors, though. We're talking 2 or 3 classic colors: gray, navy, or khaki. And of course, gray, I brought in the polyester ones instead, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So again, the Dead Poet Society guy, he's wearing this pants with this shirt with the white cable sweater. And he's a nerdy kind of character, but he's not the most nerdy character, but he still looks good in that scene, which is kind of part of the reason I have this outfit 6 times over in various, you know, forms all over my wardrobe, even more than, you know, maybe certain things like this. And a lot of stuff like that. They still have a bunch of stuff like this. I just don't wear it as much. But so yeah, it doesn't have to be pleated. But there was a big deal in like the 90s ish when Dockers was having a big to-do of backlash, I guess, of people saying, "Oh, but khaki pants are nerd wear. You know, they're old, out of style. They're not cool like same company but different subsidiary or whatever. They're not cool like your 501 jeans or whatever other fashiony jeans were coming out at the time." Because you can see this is not the same look at all, which is again why I say this isn't really nerd look, and it's not even really preppy look, because there's nothing refined about 501 jeans at all. They're patch pockets. They're, you know, big cardboard thing that I suppose you're supposed to remove this, but most people don't. You know, big watch pocket, or some call it a coin pocket. Rivets. There aren't any rivets in a pair of chinos, okay? You're not worried about the seams splitting out because you're sitting at a desk most of the time. These aren't only for sitting at a desk, but you know what I mean. You're not getting dragged by a car like Indiana Jones, and he's still not wearing these. He's wearing army pants, you know. So, whatever. And of course, Indiana Jones affected the whole thing, and then the paleontology breakthroughs with all the stuff that made Jurassic Park the cool movie was actually 80s nerd stuff. But those nerds were dressed like Indiana Jones. They weren't dressed like Spaz from... Why can't I not think of the movie? Doesn't matter. There's been different characters named Spaz in different movies, but what I don't know, was it like Porky's and maybe Caddyshack? I forget. No. Bill Murray, Meatballs. Sorry, Bill Murray and the camp counselors and all that. And there was I forget. Anyway, I should have wrote it all down before I started, but I just kind of delved into it, because this is obviously a topic that I can just talk extemporaneously off the top of my head more than many others. Yeah, I thought maybe I could make a line of vintage nerd apparel. You know, I'm not getting a puppy. I'm not becoming a goblin or doing some other fantasy costume stuff like some of the other channels, although I might talk about Hobbit fashion in the next one. No Earth Tones adventurer outfit was one of the prompts. Which can be done actually kind of easily. It just won't have the exact same. A lot of this maxi stuff actually was borrowing from or recycling 60s and 70s. That was from Decor Video. So yeah, like I said, apart from the kind of goofy t-shirts and things, but you could wear goofy t-shirts with chinos and khakis. Again, just probably not the pleated ones, because then they're more of a casual pant. Even though these are technically casual pants, they're more office friendly. Anyway, the distinctions that abound. And so that being, again, the more common nerd outfit would be some kind of slacks or chino trousers, that kind of thing. Part five. $5 foot long. Okay. Part 5. And I'll combine them ish, maybe outerwear. So I didn't bring in every single item that I have, but like I said, if you're not wearing a suit, the next thing would be a sport jacket. A sport jacket isn't necessarily a nerd staple. It's a little bit more a preppy staple. Some will look more nerdy than others. This one's a little bit bright and not as depressing as you get some of those really dark design pattern plaid-y ones that you could really find in the thrift stores from like the late 50s and the early 60s. And even women used to wear those to look, kind of newsboyish or whatever. And those were the ones I started off buying. This one's polyester, so it's borderline, but it was inexpensive. And I think the print looks okay, even for the fabric being not great. But yeah, if you wanted more of that, but that was kind of a counterculture thing too, where it was like, I'm pretending that I'm, an office kind of cub reporter guy, but really I'm just messing around. But that was the look Andrew McCarthy had in St. Elmo's Fire, where of course he would wear that jacket, but then he would wear it with like camouflage cargo pants from, from the era or whatever. So he wasn't 100% dressed nerd, but he was kind of part of the cool clique, but he was kind of the dorky member of the cool clique. Oh, dorky. I forgot to go into dorky. The thing with the dorks, another term that's kind of used along with corny and cheesy. They have slightly different meanings, but people interchange them. But dorky is not necessarily a nerd thing, but dorky is kind of like Marty McFly's dad in Back to the Future, where he's already doing dad jokes as a teenager. That's kind of dorky. Ned Flanders, "Hidely ho, neighbor." Hey, that's definitely dorky. So again, not automatically nerdy, but Ned Flanders is very Argyle sweater and Oxford cloth and these shoes, but he's very white bread, milk toast, middle of the road or whatever, religious thing. So it's more of a Bible Belt attack that they're going for with that than, he's a computer nerd or something. So a totally separate argument again, all over again. But Simpsons, of course, starting in the 80s and becoming huge in the 90s. But then I also have this corduroy one because, it kind of matches my pants. So it gives the impression of being a suit without actually being a suit. Ta-da! So if I want to wear all gray and be monochromatic professor guy, which again goes back to Animal House, where they did all have funny names, but I don't think the one guy that they called Stork, he was like a dorky spaz, right? But he didn't have much of a part, and you wouldn't necessarily call him a nerd. He was just this weird guy in one scene. Remember when we all thought Stork was brain damaged? There seems to be no evidence to the contrary, except that somehow he's in a college. Except these other guys are in college too, and they're all flunking all their classes. So, don't know. So anyway, here's and I didn't bring in a tweed model, but of course we can talk about tweed all day long. So if you had, this sport jacket and this kind of herringbone deal, again, your professor look ish, whatever, but again, not necessarily overtly nerdy, but this being a little less old money because it's kind of a grungy thrift store find, whereas old money, you know, we're trying to look more wealthy and elite than just wearing a jacket, whatever wearing a jacket means. And then again, of course, on the other hand, you might have some kind of, whereas this is not really preppy at all, this kind of windbreaker, but it's kind of in a heritage fashion. I did get it at a thrift store, so it came pre-stained and beat up and everything. But also, I'm pretty sure this is some kind of 70s blend material and not a really nice wool thing. I don't know. I doubt there's any tags still in here. And of course, the satin lining instead of a nice lining, but it works okay for, you know, certain looks and certain things and whatever. But that could be considered nerdy or frumpy or dorky or whatever. So finally, no, not finally, almost finally, part 6. Sorry, we're at part 5. Part 6. 6. Part 6. Headwear, hats, yes. So, okay, yeah, obviously, again, this being what used to be kind of not necessarily old money, because less wealthy men would still buy like one hat that was nice because there weren't, you know, like crappier options available or whatever, whereas this is a more modern rendition. You might have a real wool one of this, but you'd wear it for like 30 years till it looked like terrible condition. And, you know, like, why are you still wearing that outdated hat? That's a hat from 1952, not a hat from 1982 or whatever, you know, like that kind of thing. Whereas now, of course, stuff like this is getting popular again, you know, because of Downton Abbeys or whatever. But of course, in the 80s, a villain would be wearing this hat, or one of the characters that is a foil. You know, oh, that's the professor we all don't like. The out-of-date grumpy old guy who still wears all his junk from 1948, and the rest of us are hip and modern and da da da. So yes, I can wear this hat with this getup if I want to. Less likely would be something like this, which is more now Indiana Jones and a little more rugged than, you know, nerdy. Whereas this is more, you know, Professor Plum with the razor in the medicine chest or whatever. The other version of that, this one, the problem is, again, those club guys and mall guys have adopted the pork pie hat for certain things, so it's kind of become the douche hat, for lack of a better term. This one is a little big on me, so I don't really wear it. I have another one that fits better, but I bought this one because it was like, yeah, $12 at the used store. And so it was like, okay, that's just too perfect not to have it, even if I don't really wear it. But this is, again, dorky more than nerdy. But in the 80s, some guys would try to rock this to be like, hey, I'm hip, I'm cool. And they would be more nerdy looking because of that. There's a guy in Revenge of the Nerds who actually is wearing one of these. Before, again, the D-bags kind of co-opted them 10 years later. So there is an actual tradition of this being, again, with the dark sport coat and the plaid, and I'm trying to look like a newspaper man from 1942 because for I don't know what we were thinking, but yeah, I did that for a while there. Well, that one year it was winter though too, so wearing a wool coat made sense because it was just cold. So when I was going from one classroom to the next and I had an hour to kill, it was nice to have a jacket, and I got to loan it to a girl once, and she wore it, and I felt all special because she said her legs were cold. So I said, well, you can put my jacket on your legs. She said, no, I want to wear it. And she wore my jacket, and I wasn't as nerdy all of a sudden. Anyway, but so anyway, yeah, so 2 different Glen checks. So again, the flat cap. These ones are just cheap ones I got off Amazon. I haven't obviously used yet, but this one a little more refined, a little nicer. Again, this one also being a Glen check, just very subtle. Whereas this being, of course, a herringbone, which is less subtle of a print or weave, rather. So we have you can find them printed too, but these are woven. Whereas this a little more robust, a little more, but this is kind of heritage wear. And again, not only nerds wear this kind of thing, but if you were going to say what kind of hat does a nerd wear, I'd say number one hat would be something like this, probably most of the time. And certain baseball caps, again, if they have, you know, Superman logo or something on it, maybe. But that's not, again, a very vintage nerd look. That's more of a started in the 80s and 90s look, because he just wants to wear a hat that says, I love Superman, you know, whatever. Whereas these, obviously, either of these goes with this outfit. This one a little bit less, this one a little bit more. And I can wear, again, without the tweed jacket, I can wear this with this very easily. Whereas this goes a little bit better with this. And this can go with this, but it can also go with this. Whereas neither of these hats goes perfectly well with that jacket. But if I was going to put a hat with this jacket, it would be this. Something more like this. Then something like this. Or, again, not nerdy necessarily at all, but something like that. So that's jackets and hats. All done. 56 minutes. Wow. Okay. Oh, almost all done. The other one, the bucket hat. Again, this is not old money-ish. It's kind of dorky grandpa. And it's another one that the D-bags have kind of co-opted. But in Lucas, he wears the bucket hat, which Lucas, of course, definitely a total nerd movie. He's in love with the cheerleader. She doesn't come to town acting like a cheerleader or the typical mean girl type, and they make a friendship, and then she falls in love with Mr. Football Hero Charlie Sheen, and you know, hilarity ensues. But yeah, a bucket hat can be kind of a nerdy item, but also a casual, semi-preppy item. Again, if you need a hat for your boat, you might pick a bucket hat before you pick a baseball hat type of thing. So finally, part 3 plus 4, part 7. Save the best for last. Not a look I'm going for pretty much ever. And I brought the gray pants instead of the blue ones, because these again are polyester, meant to be part of a suit, as opposed to the khaki or chino variety. But so imagine this color in this fabric, maybe. And we are pairing that with, doesn't have to have, it could be a structured collar, but in this case it's not. But the white Oxford cloth button down or polyester. This one's cotton, but it could be short sleeve. Again, with the glasses, with the pants. Now, this is also a missionary in Africa or other looks. But when you add the one thing, which is the 60s skinny tie, and we get the penultimate NASA Florida 60s look. This is about the most vintage nerd look ever. And the pocket protector, which of course becomes a joke in Revenge of the Nerds, whereas in real life, I never knew anybody who owned a pocket protector ever once. As many nerdy, geeky science major guys and math major guys I knew, I didn't know any pocket protector guys. Most of them had long hair and were wearing flannel shirts and things by then. Looked like the all-American beer drinker sometimes, that sort of thing. But yes, the NASA look, infamous beyond belief. That whole Florida climate issue with the no air conditioning in the 60s buildings and all that. Again, if you're making a movie and you want your nerds to look nerdy, that might be the way to go. Again, the short sleeves instead of the long sleeves being part of the whole kabam. And you know, and you can do nerd looks with regular camp shirts and other things too that I didn't show, which are the short sleeve versions of, you know, pretty much any of these sport shirts, because they're all different plaids with buttons and usually one pocket, sometimes with double, blah, 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 but short sleeve, and usually not tucked in though, usually with a squared off hem. But that's where LLB and other companies have complained about this before, make the tucked in ones that is kind of a mixed metaphor, because if I'm wearing a camp shirt, I usually don't want it tucked in. But again, if I'm wearing these shoes, it can be tucked or untucked, whereas if I'm wearing loafers, usually it's tucked. If you're wearing sneakers, usually it's untucked. Again, neither of these shoes being correct for the NASA look. The NASA look would be true dress shoes to go with your dark pants, because you're in a business environment. It's not an office casual environment. You're just dressed more casually in the office, which kind of is what gave birth to the office casual concept, I think, historically. If you want to quote me on that and tell me I'm wrong, I don't know, whatever. Anyway, so that's been an hour. That's been a pretty long hour, and I don't know who's going to make it through this far to get to the NASA thing and the Dead Poet Society thing and the Lucas and the Weird Science and the Real Genius and the Nerds in Paradise and the other ones that I didn't even talk about because this is long. I don't think I forgot anything, though. I think I got through everything, even if it wasn't all in perfect order. So if you have any questions, put them in the comments, because there might be something I forgot that I don't know that I forgot, and I would love to hear it so I can address it. And I'll let you go so I can get on with my day too.